Good afternoon and welcome to our International Association of Academicians for Peace webinar under the title West Meets East in Northeast Asia, a Values Proposition. My name is Robert Duffy and I serve as Secretary General of the Universal Peace Federation for Canada. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session. A driving force in the ongoing series of webinars on the search for peace on the Korean Peninsula, Dr. Michael Jenkins is the International President of the Universal Peace Federation and the President of the Washington Times Foundation, a tireless global peace advocate and someone I consider a friend. Please welcome Dr. Michael Jenkins. Sir, the floor is yours.
First, I'd like to thank Robert Duffy, who's Secretary General of the Universal Peace Federation for Canada, for his outstanding leadership in helping develop this association of academicians. Our program today is on East meets West and a value proposition. We want to understand the cultural differences of East and West and apply that to our ongoing theme, which is on every Tuesday, in which we examine the possibilities and the situation for peace in Northeast Asia. And what we're doing is also examining every different aspect of the UPF focus, which is on heads of state, members of parliament, also people in security and also in intelligence, as well as academia, media, business, and also religious leaders. We've gotten varied perspectives. And there's so many ways to look at the situation of China, Russia, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and the United States, and our allies there. And we're seeking to find good dialogue and good foundations of common ground in which we can build friendships and move towards peace. Our first speaker today is Dr. Thomas Ward. Dr. Ward is the president of the Unification Theological Seminary. He's a scholar and also a writer who has published many books on the topic of peace and freedom throughout the world. And I'd like to welcome him at this time, Dr. Thomas Ward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. It's really an honor for me to be here with all of you. And a special shout out to Senator Bob Coffin. Actually, I haven't seen him for a long period of time. He did text me here, and I remember him back from the very beginning days of the American Leadership Conference. Thank you so much for joining us today, Senator Coffin. It's really a pleasure to have a chance to touch base with you again, and I hope we'll be able to do more as we go forward in this very important undertaking. I typically feel more comfortable speaking in the area of peace, conflict resolution, comparative political systems, rather than the topic that I'm going to be touching upon today. I would really want to recognize that Dr. Selover, who follows after me, is much more versed in the area of Confucianism than I am. But nevertheless, I did feel it was appropriate to share some thoughts today because of certain of my experiences from being in East Asia and also Southeast Asia, which I think would be relevant for today's program. So I hope you all can see my screen there. And my presentation, quite simply, refers to values East and West. In February of 1986, shortly after Corazon Aquino came to power, I made my first visit to the Philippines. And I ended up having a whole variety of experiences there. And I actually ended up having the opportunity to do my doctoral studies with Brother Andrew Gonzalez, the president of De La Salle University. I had a chance over a 3-year period to work there. And he kind of emphasized that if I was going to do my thesis in the Philippines, that I had to familiarize myself with the Filipino value system. And the topic of my doctoral thesis, which Robert Duffy required me to think about again after 30 some years, was models of socioeconomic development and their educational implications towards a Filipino synthesis. And I think that my findings in that particular thesis, which I'm pulling out of my files from nowhere, Robert, but having a chance to be able to look at that again, I think it is relevant for today's discussion. So let me say a few things about the Philippines. Until the 14th century, pretty much the Philippines, they they developed, there were immigrations to the islands, etc. But in the 14th century, Islam came to the southern part of the Philippines from the Persian Gulf. And then 2 centuries later, you began Spanish colonial rule. And the United States likewise became the colonial power in the Philippines from 1905 to 1945. The next chapter of the Philippines history, I would say, would be post-1945. And then post-1986, the so-called EDSA revolution, which brought Corazon Aquino to power, I think it opens another epoch in terms of Philippines history. So the interesting thing that most people do not know about the Philippines is that the Philippines during this 300-year period was actually a part of New Spain, which means in fact that it was a part of Mexico. It was a part, the trade and the vice regent who oversaw the Philippines was the same vice regent who oversaw Mexico. And these are the trade routes of the Spanish Empire during that 200-300-year period. And basically every year, at least on 2 occasions, and often not much more than that, there were spices and other products which were brought from the Philippines to Mexico. And that was during this entire period of being under the Spanish Vice Regency of Mexico. So in my dissertation, I looked at 4 possible models for the future development of the Philippines. There was the obvious Western model, which the Philippines had been exposed to in different forms since the 16th century. There was the Marxist model, the NPA, the New People's Army, was quite active back in the 1980s in the Philippines. There was also talk about a Christian socialist model or a liberation theology model. And then the 4th one, which I introduced at that time, was the Confucian model. And if we look at Confucius in the Analects, he describes himself as a transmitter and not a maker, believing in and loving the ancients. And he said, I am not the one who was born in possession of knowledge. I am one who is fond of antiquity and earnest in seeking it there. I think one of the great things about Confucius is he was able to take what was going on in Chinese society, in Asian society in a broader sense, and he was able to weave it together in a beautiful way. And it makes so much sense. And if you haven't read the Analects, I would really encourage you to read it. Myself, I find peace every time I read it. There's just an incredible message there, something that's really healing the soul in terms of the way in which Confucius understood so many things. And in the Great Learning, he talked about basically the 5 key relationships: the relationship that exists between the sovereign and minister, between father and son, between husband and wife, between elder brother and younger, and also the relationship amongst friends. And really, that is the prism from my experience in Asia. I spent a year in Japan. I've been to Korea probably close to 100 times. I had this chance to go back and forth in the Philippines during a 3-year period, 1986, 87, 88. And I found that somehow this perspective of seeing things from the viewpoint of family is a remarkable attribute of Asian culture. Those 5 key relationships that I mentioned, you know. And those relationships that Confucius addresses, if you look at Filipino culture, you'll find the same thing, you know, like in the case of Korea, you know, elder sister, maybe Nuna. In the case of Filipino, it's called ate, you know, hyung, kuya, dongseng, bunso. I mean, the same types of concepts and the tendency to look at those around you, not just your immediate family, but in the Philippines, they sometimes use the term familia, which is not just family, but it's broader than that. And the sense, there is this desire for community, this desire for relationship from a familial perspective. And as I studied, I also found a whole variety of other concepts which are deep within Asian culture, like the whole importance of relationship because of where you studied, what region you came from, where, you know, those types of things, they bring people together. In Japanese, it's called en. In Korean, it's called yon. And in Filipino, it's called utang no loob. but basically this sense that somehow you feel connected to someone because of where they're from, where they studied, or whatever else, because you share that common bond. And anyway, there's no time to talk about this, but the notion of Ming or fate, and in Bayanihan culture, there's a notion of Bahalana, which is very similar as well. And understanding that, it's not just faith, but also humanity to some sense can be able to change and adjust that faith as well. But what I think is where we find a connecting point between Asian culture and Western culture is in the Great Learning, where Confucius talks about the rectification of names. And I'll just read this quote because I think it's an important one. It says, "The ancients who wished to illustrate illustrious virtue throughout the kingdom first ordered well their own states. Wishing to order well their states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to cultivate their families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they first rectified their hearts. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge." This pursuit of trying, the whole rectification of heart, rectification of name, ultimately on an individual level, trying to figure out who exactly one is. And I think that the important contribution that the missionaries brought to Asia, to Africa, and to other places, ideally, was this identity. The fundamental message that Jesus brought was the message of the gospel, a story about the promise and perseverance of God to deliver and restore human dignity as God's children, which is referred to in 1 John and in 1 Corinthians, the notion of the human being being a temple of God. So there has been an evolution of development in the West, beginning with Jesus' word. We know that I think it relates, in some sense, his message is the ultimate rectification of names and hearts by really defining what the real human potential is. St. Paul played such a key role in the mainstreaming of Christianity. And Augustine of Hippo's City of God, for any of us who've studied political science, you read, you're first of all going to read Plato, and then you're going to read Aristotle's Politics, and then you're going to read City of God. And the City of God is really a roadmap for the way in which society was supposed to be conducted in a world which was awaiting, at some point or other, a second coming. And then finally, Thomas Aquinas picks up the mantle from Augustine, and he provides us with a rationale and explanation for religious, social, and scientific order, which really served as a roadmap during that medieval period. But then along comes Thomas Hobbes, by the way, also a deeply religious man. And when we read the Leviathan, we find that he has there a rationale for the state. And he talks there about the whole concept in terms of his rationale for the state of the fact of the need for a social contract, because people fear that by themselves in the state of nature, they have no security. So they sacrifice a certain portion of their sovereignty in order to have security. And then along comes John Locke. And his writing, his perspective into politics, into rule of law is so powerful. And we know that his second treatise on government in so many ways provides a framework for the United States Declaration of Independence. And then you come to Adam Smith and his text on the Wealth of Nations, which talks about an ending of mercantilism and speaks about eventually approaching a point where there could be a free market economy. And Smith was not interested in capitalists. He was not interested in the wealthy. His point was, because England and France, because they're blocking their borders, because they won't let products come from one country to another, therefore, French people have poor wool and British people have poor wine. And they pay a fortune for those things because there's no free trade. So you're not just hurting the states, the mega states, so to speak, you're hurting the individual. And that was really something compelling for Smith. Mm-hmm. And Smith had within him something which was known as the impartial spectator, which he said all human beings have, which was the ability to detect what is right and what is wrong. So the interesting thing, by the way, I don't have time to read this here. Well, I'll read the one part, is that Mencius, if you can believe this, he already had 200 years after Confucius, he already had a pretty clear idea about the idea of a free market. Mencius wrote, in the marketplace of his capital, he, the ruler, should levy a ground rent on the shops, but do not tax the goods or enforce the proper regulations without levying a ground rent. Then all the traders of the kingdom will be pleased and wish to store their goods in his marketplace. If at his frontier passes there be no inspection of persons, but no taxes charged on goods or other articles, then all the travelers of the kingdom will be pleased and wish to make their tours on his roads. So amazing that this concept was there. Jean-Jacques Rousseau elaborated further on the social contract, and Voltaire played an important role in the avoidance of dogma within governance. So there are these values, East and West, as I said, that exist, and a relationship has to exist between the two of them. And we recognize that through Jesus, there was a certain identity that was provided to enhance human understanding of oneself. And through the Confucian tradition and the Asian tradition as a whole, doesn't matter where you go, even North Korea, this notion of relationships is extremely important and key to making things happen. I want to point, though, however, to a reality of the West and why we can benefit from the lessons of Asia. Look at these foundational figures that I spoke about today. Jesus was single, he had no children. St. Paul was single. Augustine had a child before he dedicated himself to God, but he was single, he did not marry. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was single. Thomas Hobbes was single and had no children. John Locke was single and had no children. Adam Smith was single and had no children. So to conclude, I'd like to say simply this. Christianity has gone through its stages. What I'm talking about here is the best of Christianity. Obviously, over the centuries, Christianity became ritualized, and sometimes that identity that was brought at the foundations of Christianity was lost to some extent. And in the post-Christian period, it's even far more lost and confused. And I hope that's one of the things we will discuss in our follow-up. But the same is true for Confucianism. That original Confucianism, what you read in the Analects, what you read when you read the Mencius. I mean, there's something very powerful that really touches you. There's something very alive there. But also, as Confucianism emerged, it became ritualized. We fell into Neo-Confucianism. And then basically a post-Confucian period where even, for example, if we look at today's Confucius institutes, they have very little to do with Confucius. And it's basically using a name in order to advance a political objective, tragically. So long story short, I think Christianity can really solve the rectification of names and rectification of part puzzle within Confucianism. And I think that Confucianism can reinforce within Christianity, because so many of the founding mentors were single and with no children, reinforce the fundamental paradigm of the family as the basis to the key of meaningful social relationships. And I believe that's fundamentally what Mother Moon is trying to do. She's both trying to reawaken this foundational significance of the family and also reminding all of us of our fundamental identity as children of God, as was taught so many thousands of years ago. So those are my reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. Really excellent presentation and a lot to think about. We do want to mention that as a research fellow at Academia Sinica Institute of Modern History in Taipei, and your work was published there at the East Asia Quarterly, the Journal of Asian Studies, and the Washington Times, as well as International Relations in London. Academia Sinica, Institute of Modern History. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
Introduce at this time Dr. Thomas Selover. He's going to speak on cultural and religious values contributing toward reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. And that's been our weekly focus on how we can enhance and understand better relations for Northeast Asia, including the Korean Peninsula. Dr. Selover is president of Sunhak University Peace Graduate School near Seoul. He has taught at universities and colleges in Canada and the United States, as well as in China and Korea. His research is focused on spiritual values and human relatedness and their contribution toward a society of interdependence and mutual prosperity. He also is fluent in Chinese and achieved that through scholarship and practice. Welcome, Dr. Thomas Selover.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins, and I'm very happy to have an opportunity to be part of this this immediate discussion and also part of the larger discussion that this webinar series represents. I want to thank UPF North America for organizing this series, and also all of our chapters of the International Association of Academicians for Peace, which is a worldwide network of concerned academic leaders, which we are building all around the world, expressing shared concern for interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. I'm happy to bring this kind of perspective to the study of the Korean Peninsula, because I think that investigating the cultural and religious background of the Korean Peninsula helps us to move beyond the political impasse. And I want to explain a little bit about how that might be. Excuse me just a second. Let me bring you a presentation. Just bear with me a minute. I'm speaking to you from South Korea, the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, so maybe the technology is a little bit slow. Give me another minute here. I see. Okay. With begging your pardon. You know, okay, come on, friends. Okay. There we are. Okay. All right, so my theme is cultural and religious values contributing toward reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. Many people question what religions can do in this secular age. I answer, and this is Reverend Dr. Sam Young-moon speaking, I answer that the world's religions need to provide a stable, universal foundation of values upon which governments can build true peace and harmony. So the religious traditions, the cultural traditions provide the foundation of values upon which governments can work. And so I want to explore that with you in the case of the Korean Peninsula. So this is the familiar map of the Korean Peninsula, sharply divided between two regimes that are not only ideologically at loggerheads, but facing each other across the world's most fortified border. And my understanding is that this series of webinars has been exploring the military and other aspects of this conflict quite thoroughly. Here's another map of the Korean Peninsula, more united as it has been in the past. And I'd like to point out some of the religious traditions that flourished on the whole of the Korean Peninsula. To begin with, first, the indigenous tradition, going back, let's say, about 5,000 years. The standard date is 2333 BC for the beginning of this tradition, but it could be older than that. Then, and I'll say more about each one of them in turn, then we have the Confucian tradition, which Dr. Ward has just been explaining to us. And I have a couple of things to say about that as well. We also have the Buddhist tradition on the Korean Peninsula, very important, and innovations in Buddhist tradition, particular to Korea. Then, of course, the Christian tradition. And each one of those four traditions brings something particular to the mix of the possibility of a motivation to overcome this terrible history of division on the Korean Peninsula. So let me begin first with the indigenous tradition, the lore of the founding figure of the Korean people and the Korean cultural tradition, known as Dangun Wangum. That he comes from a divine or a semi-divine source. He's identified with the powers of nature as well, and also with good governance. The watchword of Dangun's tradition is to benefit humankind, Hongekingdan, greatly benefiting humankind, or greatly benefiting all the people. And so this is a kind of underlying theme which remains even to this day in both the North and the South. Here we see the traditional mausoleum of Dangun, which would be from about, if it were original, it'd be about 5,000 years old. This is in northern Korea, near Pyongyang, claimed to be the tomb of Dangun, the legendary founder of the first Korean kingdom. So the lore and legacy of Dangun is very important in the North as well as in the South. So that tradition feeds down into the later history in the tradition of shamanism, in the tradition of worshiping or venerating the powers of the natural world and being able to perceive spiritually what is the destiny of the people. So here we have two representatives of the shamanistic tradition. Over here on the right, this is Mount Baekdu, a volcano at the highest point on the Korean Peninsula, which is considered sacred in a kind of sacred geography of the Korean Peninsula, sacred to Koreans of both the North and the South. It's understood to have been the birthplace of Dangun. And we see here the modern figures, Kim Jong-un of the North and Moon Jae-in of the South, are meeting on Mount Baekdu. That is to say, they're exactly on the foundation of this long tradition of values. And this shamanistic tradition extends throughout the whole of the Korean Peninsula. Then, secondly, the Confucian religious culture, which came into Korea from China, but Koreans have kind of made it their own, even saying perhaps Confucius is really a Korean after all, which is a kind of high praise for Confucius, I guess. The Confucian tradition, you know, as Dr. Ward was explaining, there are really a couple of values that I want to lift up within Confucian tradition. The first one is the practice of human-heartedness or human heartful relationship. In Korean, in Chinese, ren. I'll come back to that concept in a minute. And the other one, hyo, the concept of filial piety, the relationship between parents and children. And here you have a classic example of that. The filial piety doesn't mean the vigorous adult dominating the poor little kid, as some Western interpreters tend to think of it. The other way around, the vigorous adult carrying the now infirm parent on his or her back. That's the literal form of the character, the younger carrying the elder. And so filial piety, hyo, supports a stable and just, peaceful social order. Now, in the very character itself, and one could go on for a while talking about the characters, the hanja there, the left-hand side of it has to do with human being, and the right-hand side of it has to do with relationship. So human being is understood as fundamentally relational, which is a different concept than we find in either Western psychology or in sociology. It's neither one of those. The relationship is real. It's a reality which is as real as the respective individuals. And so the sense of relatedness, the sense that that connection between people, there's another word I didn't put up here called jong, which means the sense of being connected to each other. So hyo jong, as a form of jong, connection feeling, is a very powerful term. So this Confucian value is deeply embedded in both North and South. Then we have Buddhist religious culture, also coming in about the same time from China, but also developing in its own unique way on the Korean Peninsula. So the Buddhist tradition is especially a tradition of cultivation, of mind-body cultivation. And over on the right, we have the Sukkuram Grotto, a heritage site of Buddhist iconography. And along with that, we have not only the historical record of the Buddha, but the live practice of meditation. Meditation which brings harmony between theory and practice. Long training in this kind of tradition is also part of the religious heritage of the Korean Peninsula. And Buddhist tradition is very much active in the South, and I think incipient also in the North. So to this interreligious mix came Christianity, as you know, especially in the 19th century. The history of Christianity in Korea is complex, a strange and troubled history, and yet remarkable. Partly for the intensity of the early Christians, first Catholic Christians who were willing to be martyred rather than to become apostates. And so the martyrdom of early Christians in Korea is very important to the foundation, the sacrificial foundation, which can lead to healing this great division. Now, there is a higher percentage of Christians in South Korea than in any other nation in East Asia. Let me say that this general picture of Buddhist tradition and Confucian tradition is very much relevant to the other players in East Asian culture. But the predominance of Christianity, or the influence of Christianity, is unique to Korea, to the point that Pyongyang in the north was known as Jerusalem of the East. So although Christians are not in the majority in South Korea, the percentage is much higher than anywhere else in East Asia. And you can see on this chart that the percentage of Christians steadily increased between 1950, the liberation of from 45, the liberation of Korea from Japanese colonial rule, and then up through the late 1990s, increasing percentages, but that has leveled off now. And percentage now would be about 30 or 31%, and it's not expected to rise. In fact, there is decline in the Christian churches as well. And so that means that there's a particular opportunity now. I call it a window of opportunity this year, next year. Why? Partly because of the COVID crisis, which has affected nations all over the world. So all nations have been humbled. Everyone has had to deal with something that was unprecedented for them, and we're still in that. Nobody has the solution completely. Number two, there's great need in North Korea, and even in terms of the economy. Kim Jong-un has said quite frankly that this is the worst things have been. Also, there's a new emphasis on human fraternity, and that goes back to this Confucian concept of yin, the fundamental human relatedness, and indeed all the way back to Hongik Ingan, greatly benefiting all of humankind. Also, we've recognized the limitations of geopolitical efforts and calculations on resolving the Korean situation. Third point is that the historical memory of one Korea is, it's fragile, I would say. We're still in the generation where people remember unified Korea before the Korean War, or in their very early life, the Korean War. But that generation is passing very quickly. And so if there's not enough passing on of that passion to restore the unity of the peninsula, then things will become much more difficult 5, 10, 15 years later. There's also, I would say, concern about secularizing trends in the South, that this religious heritage that I've been talking about is powerful, but it's got some counter trends in today's South Korea, so that it's important that this foundation be mobilized now. Therefore, I want to bring up the core values that UPF promotes around the world: interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. In Korean, gongseng, gongyong, gongwi. These three value principles are clearly related by the Korean terms in this concept of gong, which means mutuality, which means sharing, which means connectedness. So that connectedness is not only horizontal between you and me, but it's vertical too, between heaven and earth. And so that mutuality is at the core of what we mean by interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. This vision of gong, reconciliation, based on these value principles, is fed by the deep springs of widely benefiting humankind through Confucian humane concern, Buddhist compassion, and Christian love, all of which are flourishing here. So, how to actionize that religious and cultural motivation? The concept of interdependence also includes interdependence with the natural world, and certainly we need to have much more sensitivity to the natural environment than we do. And we find that the indigenous tradition is especially strong in that, this shamanistic sense that we're part of one cosmos together. In terms of mutual prosperity, the model is indeed the family, and the Confucian tradition is especially strong in being a value base for the realization of that. Then universal values in one form or another are promoted by both of these universal religious traditions. Both the Buddhist tradition and the Christian tradition have spread all over the world and are open-ended traditions, inviting anyone to come and participate in those universal values. So, mutuality in practice, how might it work? Interdependence with the natural world based on these indigenous shamanistic tradition and the tradition of benefiting all of humankind, the tradition of family, and the tradition of universal values can lead to ecological assistance. And that's going on between North and South. Even though the politicians are still fighting each other, there are efforts such as reforestation going on to address the common ecological problems of the Korean Peninsula. So this kind of, if you will, shamanistically related motivation is very much relevant to actual projects on the peninsula today. And then this sense of human community can manifest in local community assistance, not only government to government, but even locality to locality. That would be a much more realistic basis for actually building reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. And then thirdly, faith-based social services, whether of the Christian form or of the Buddhist form, and also the tradition of personal cultivation, which is needed in both North and South, as well as a sense of shared human responsibility. So all of these 3 and 4 major traditions can provide that kind of motivation beyond the political calculations. Governments alone cannot do this. And indeed, the government's motivation is bound to be mixed. But this deeper cultural motivation can actually lead us forward. This is the vision of reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula that Dr. Hak Jahan Moon is promoting with great vigor and optimism under the banner of Heavenly Unified Korea. Shin Tonggil Hanga. the goodwill and support of faithful friends around the world is vital to the success of this vision. So that's what I'd like to share with you today.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Selover. That was just another excellent presentation. We do have some questions from the audience, which I'd like to present to you both. We have participants from around the world. About 30 countries in Europe are online with us here, as well as all over the United States, and a few from Asia. One question, Confucianism and Asian culture generally are authoritarian from the father downward and from the elder brother downward. Is democracy and the way we practice democracy in the West alien to Asia? Dr. Ward?
Can I suggest that I pass that one to Dr. Selover? I think he's the
Sure,
best.
Dr. Selover?
Well, authority is something that's recognized and honored. That's true. However, the traditional understanding of those relationships is that the response of the young to the elders is a reciprocal appreciation for the care that they were given when they were young and helpless. And so I think it has to be recognized that there's a notion of mutuality at the core of that rather than authoritarianism. And so the question about whether democracy can work is, I think, the question about brothers and sisters, because the concept of filial piety also supports the relationship between brothers and sisters. Now, it is true that there's kind of elder and younger, and that's very much a feature of Korean society. We have to know how old a person is to know how much to respect them, so to speak, and that's still true. And there's some virtue in that, and the older I get, the more I see it. I think the case for democracy has to be, in Asia, has to be made not on the basis of individual rights, but on the basis of shared responsibility. In that way, then democracy is quite compatible with the foundation, which is here. Thank you.
How about Dr. Ward? This is for you. Concerning the family and spirituality and traditions of the East, Kim Jong-un appears to have no heir at this time. Do the normal cultural rules of Confucianism still work in North Korea? Or does totalitarianism and worship of the state and great leaders completely override the traditional culture as far as you can tell?
I've been lucky enough to go to North Korea twice. I have to confess, though, that it's been a long time since I was there. It's been almost 30 years. So I can only share what I observed when I was there. I actually, I think some of you may be aware, I spent a week in North Korea by myself, actually, which was quite an interesting experience. And I guess I spent altogether, I guess, about 3 weeks in North Korea and had some remarkable experiences there. Now, what I observed is, first of all, Juche ideology and the way in which North Koreans deal, their approach to communism is not at all the same as Soviet-style communism or doctrinaire communism that you might find in many of the countries that in other parts of the world. They have a great sense of pride, if you will, about themselves, about who they are, and Kim Il-sung is a person who was viewed as having been highly successful because he could handle everybody. He could handle Truman, he could handle Mao, he could handle Stalin. He managed to handle all kinds of people. So their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism is not the same as the type of doctrinaire Marxism you see in other places. It's an extremely authoritarian place. There's no question about that. But still, I think a lot of the dynamics that Dr. Selover talked about, from my very limited experience, I've met North Koreans, I think 6 times over this period of time. my feeling is still relationship is extremely important and key to understanding how they do everything, you know. And I just mentioned briefly that, you know, when a decision was made by Kim Il-sung back in 1992 to end Hate America Month, because of Reverend Moon's initiatives in North America. It ended for 1 year. He suspended it for a year. He chose a certain way to convey the message. Normally, he should have gone through the ambassador of China, but instead he went directly to the American Freedom Coalition, our leader then, Congressman Eichord. I was also invited to be there. And what was explained to us was something very clear. I'm telling you this because I want you to report this to the White House, because I want very clearly that the work that Reverend Moon has been doing in North Korea and the importance of that work be recognized by the White House. So the relational aspect, I think, is still very much there. But there's an awful lot of paranoia and other things. It's not a normal situation. And I do think, as Dr. Selover mentioned, you know, governments can't do this. This is a civil society-based initiative, I think, that must change. You need to change the culture before you can change the law. That's a principle. You must change culture before you can change law. So the work that's being done, Dr. Jenkins, by you, by Dr. Walsh, by Larry Muffet, by Dr. Selover, and by so many others, it's very, very important, because you are key to changing the culture so that we can be able to build trust and do something which is constructive. So that's my sense of things.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. Another, Dr. Selover, go ahead.
I'd just like to add something. Thank you. You know, there are Confucian dimensions to this very important historic meeting between Reverend Dr. Samyang Moon, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, and Chairman Kim Il-sung. Actually, the whole language of brotherhood, of elder brother and younger brother, may sound a little bit forced and kind of odd outside of the Korean situation, but it worked. It worked because there's a deep root there. If you recognize someone as your elder brother, then there's responsibilities that go along with that. And so that was the rhetorical frame of that meeting, which made it possible and successful. And there's other Confucian principles embedded in that. The thing we need to focus on is harmony. Harmony is the most important thing. However, harmony by itself, if you just aim at harmony, it may not be successful. You need ritual as well in order to harmonize. And so the role of ritual, when we see that meeting, the ritual itself is part of the reconciliation process. And third, I would mention is the concept of being able to harmonize without agreeing. Confucius said the profound people can harmonize well even if they don't agree, and petty people can't harmonize even if they do agree. And so that allowing different perspectives but still creating harmony, I think, is an important principle which is relevant to the reconciliation process. Thank you.
Thank you. Prestigious author used to be in the Beijing Bureau of the Washington Post, named Anna Fifield, is now in New Zealand. She wrote a book called The Great Successor. It's a very, very interesting book about Kim Jong-un and the lifestyles in North Korea. And it's fascinating. There's much more to the story than generally what we've heard when we're dealing with China or North Korea. And that is that the cultural traditions of Korean culture are absolutely in full force in the Korean families. It's the same cultural traditions of food, the same cultural traditions of family, and also loyalty, incredible loyalty. And so there is a deep tradition. And one thing that's affecting North Korea is when they do get videos from South Korean soap operas, causes trouble because they realize that their brothers and sisters in the South are just like them. They eat the same cuisine, they have the same parental relations, that kind of thing is going on. However, what about the religious cultural traditions? Korea was known for one of the most powerful Christian developments, and Pyongyang was called, as you noted, Dr. Selover, the Jerusalem of the East. And what is going on with Christianity in North Korea? And what about Buddhism in North Korea too? It is still there, but what is the freedom of religion situation for Dr. Selover? And then for Dr. Ward, how did Christianity from the United States impact the culture of South Korea, where it's still very, very strong participation of the 29 to 31% of Korean Christians? So Dr. Selover, you're first.
Well, I mean, I almost think we should take those questions in the opposite way. I'd like to lob the first one over to Dr. Ward, and then have a trade for a crack at the second one.
All right, but then you answer the second one first.
All right then. So,
what's the impact of Christianity on the
right,
Republic of Korea, and how does that affect its relations with the West?
The effect is huge, certainly. And the linkage between Korean Christians and North American Christians is very strong, both in terms of filiation, that it's, I mean, Korean Christianity is divided into primarily into the denominations which have come from North America. So, but there's a special feature there. There's more different kinds of Presbyterians. There's more Presbyterian denominations than in Korea than there are in the United States. Now the linkage goes the other way. So Korean churches send missionaries to the United States to help revive Christian culture in the US. In Canada, this is a very strong feature. The Korean Presbyterian group within Canadian Presbyterianism is quite strong. So in terms of the wider society, one of the issues for people who are not Christians is the evangelism of Christianity. And there was a period where the Christian churches here were quite connected with a sort of gospel of wealth. If you believe, you'll become prosperous. And later events have called that into question. And so there is a kind of searching among Christian churches in Korea today for a different kind of model forward. And that's why the KCLC in Korea is very important, to link Christians with conscientious people of other religious traditions.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. How about Buddhism and Christianity in North Korea and religious freedom in general? And are the Confucian cultures or traditions still as much as alive in North Korea as the traditions of Korean culture?
I had a chance to visit 2 Christian churches when I was in North Korea. I felt, I'm being very candid, I didn't feel that they were very open. I felt, that there was not a lot of openness in the churches. They were there, they existed, and there was, Christians who wanted to practice their faith, there was some way to be able to do it, but I think it was kind of similar to the kind of thing, if you remember way back, that we might have seen like in the Soviet Union when you went to a church there. So I think that it was not a typical Christianity, if you will. I'm not the one to speak on Buddhism, but let me just say something about the Confucianism piece. And I'd like to do that through an example, if you will, which I think will be helpful. Sure. And I think will help us to have some insight into the power of that tradition and perspective, which is so special within Korean culture. And I say this because I see here Dr. Jenkins, and I see Senator Kaufman, and I see Mr. Larry Moffat, and I recall a story about our beloved friend, all of us, Dr. Bohi Pak, who passed away 2 years ago. And one day I heard a story from one of Dr. Pak's relatives, and Dr. Pak Dr. Park's family was not in such a strong economic position. One of his uncles was better off, and he had 3 sons. And his first son he paid to be able to get an education. But the second son, he did not pay to get an education. Instead, he took that money and he paid to get Dr. Park an education. So this son was very hurt and went to his father and said, "Father, why? Why didn't you pay for my education? Why did you pay for his education instead?" And his father said, "I had to do it because that man is for the nation. That man is meant to serve the nation. So I'm sorry, son, I can't help you, but I had to do this because that man is destined to serve the nation." So my point is that, that kind of higher sense is there, that noble spirit in North Korea. Reverend Moon went to North Korea with Mother Moon in 1991. And at the 10th anniversary of going there, of his going there, he really insisted upon Peter Kim somehow finding a way to go there to commemorate those 10 years, to show how much he valued the fact that Kim Il-sung had received him. And when Kim Il-sung passed away, Reverend Moon was desperate to have Dr. Bohee Pak to go there as a representative to show how close and how much he respected Kim Il-sung. And those kinds of things touch hearts. They move people to think beyond themselves. And I think that beautiful tradition, you find it in both North and South Korea. And it's like, I think the highest expression of the superior man, if you will, the Confucian ideal, I think is there in that beautiful dimension of Korean culture and tradition. So I thought.
Thank you. Dr. Ward, you wrote a book called March to Moscow. Will you be writing a book on March to Pyongyang? And what did you learn from the March to Moscow that could help us understand how to open up and bring a peaceful unification of North and South Korea?
I think the main lesson of March to Moscow is you have to do 2 things. You have to be strong, militarily strong. Every other way, you've got to be strong. You've got to be loyal to your principles. And you've always got to be ready to give another chance to the side that you're trying to bring into your camp. You've always got to be willing to do that. You don't let down your defenses, but you're always open to talk, and you're always respectful, and you're always caring. And I think that dimension has already been shown. The amazing thing about when Reverend Moon passed, who honored him when he passed? The North Koreans. They declared him 2 days after his death a hero of reunification. So that he was strong. He was principled. When he went to North Korea, he didn't say, "Oh, your ideas are so wonderful and I respect all the things." He didn't do that. He basically said, "You're nice people, but your principles are not going to be sufficient to bring this country together. You need me. If you're going to bring this country, you need me." But he was caring, he was concerned, he was loving, and therefore he could move the hearts of the North Koreans. I think that's the key. Strong, but also compassionate.
Very, very good. Since the 4 religious traditions hail back to the single founding fathers, where would you see the connection to the role of mothers and women in the current and future scheme of things, in particular, Mother Moon's work? Either one of you.
I think Mother Moon's work is really key. I think that although those male founders are longing for their female counterparts, I think it's very, very important. By the way, that not only at the time of Reverend Moon's passing, but every year since then, tribute comes from the North in honor of his passing, and gifts are given to Mother Moon from the North. So there's that sense of respect. actually more public respect perhaps in the North than here in the South. That's what we're working on now. We need to get a certain amount of recognition in the South, and then things can move forward.
Well, we've almost spent our whole hour here. It's been just fascinating. We'd like to have each of you answer one more question and then give final remarks. One thing for sure, when Reverend Moon wrote his autobiography, it was very clear, as Dr. Ward said, strength and resolve and political strength and so forth are very key to building peace. But it was very clear that his engagement with Kim Il-sung was cultural. The main door opener was a cultural sharing of heart over the Korean traditions and customs and establishing that rapport. First, he had to pass a test, though, that he wasn't afraid. And they challenged him just before he met Kim Il-sung. And I think, Dr. Ward, you could tell us a little bit about that. But then when they gathered together in his autobiography, he talks about how they just became brothers because they just related on the cultural common ground that they shared, and both being from North Korea. And I think it was a phenomenal thing that occurred. And it gives me hope that the 38th parallel will one day become a peace park and North and South Korea will open, because hearts can change. People can change. It sounds a little bit hopeful or overly optimistic, but Dr. Ward, what do you think about that? What was that test Reverend Moon was given by some of the officials before he met Kim Il-sung? And then when he got together with Kim Il-sung, it wasn't about politics. It was focused on building a new nation together.
Well, basically, those who were basically Kim Il-sung's representatives, they wanted to try to dominate him. They wanted to basically emphasize that Kim Il-sung's views, his approach, his focus, everything, how wonderful it all was and how everything was going to change. And Father stood up to them and said, no, this is not. And as a matter of fact, even people like Dr. Pak and Mrs. Pak and Peter Kim and others, they started to think, are we going to get out of this place alive even? Because Father took such a strong perspective in relationship to these individuals. And they thought, oh, Kim Il-sung will never see you now. After what you said, he'll never see you. But somehow Kim Il-sung was big enough to be able to see Reverend Moon. And Reverend Moon had prayed before he went to North Korea. He and Mother Moon had prayed. They'd spent time at our location in Hawaii before flying on from there. They spent days praying. And it was to basically completely clear their hearts of everything and to be able to just see Kim Il-sung. So when Reverend Moon saw Kim Il-sung, he could call him elder brother, Hyung. He could call Kim Il-sung elder brother. Who else had the guts to call Kim Il-sung elder brother? Everybody else was, scared to death of him. But Reverend Moon said he called him elder brother. And the other thing, if you look at the photos of Father Moon with Kim Il-sung, you'll see he's always holding Kim Il-sung's hand. And as someone expressed it, once Reverend Moon takes somebody's hand, he never lets go. He never lets go. His absolute commitment from that point was, somehow I'm gonna win this man. I'm gonna turn things around. I'm gonna just keep on loving him. He somehow opened up and trusted me. I'm gonna show him that trust was worthwhile. And so that was the beautiful thing. He melted the Koreans' hearts. When I visited North Korea, if you go to North Korea, I don't know how things are now, but when I went, there were nothing but like Kim Il-sung and Juche things on television all day. There were 3 channels and all 3 of them were Juche and Kim Il-sung things. But I saw several times while I was watching, I don't think that they did it for me, but maybe they did. I saw several times they had these rallies and things where they recognized Father Moon as one of the 7 heroes of reunification of Korea. So the reality is he won their hearts. He won all the ideology and everything else. What he said was, blood is thicker than water. You're my brother. We're brothers. We're countrymen, and that's how we have to come together. We're brothers. Therefore, we have to think together enough as brothers to save this nation, to make it be what it's meant to be, to fulfill its destiny. So those are my thoughts.
I did read where that also opened up a good relationship with his son, Kim Jong-il. And Kim Il-sung passed on that the one person from the West you can deal with and trust is Reverend Moon. That was really quite interesting.
Amazing.
And Dr. Selover, first of all, Mr. Bob Coffin also wrote in, and Dr. Ward, I think you should take this. Dr. Coffin is an elected official from Nevada for many years and now is retired, a really great ambassador for peace. And he asks, is Russia and China working against the reunification of Korea?
Russia and China do not want a unified Korea, which is an ally with the United States. They're happy to have a unified Korea if it's under the wing of China. They're happy. Well, maybe Russia is less happy, but anyway, they're ready to settle for that. But what they don't want is a unified Korea, which is allied with the United States. That's their concern. They do not want United States forces, on the Yalu River protecting the Korean Peninsula. That they don't want.
Dr. Selover, you mentioned about reforestation. We had a program on this weekly program with Dr. Lee from the United States, who has organized great efforts for reforestation in North Korea, in the Pyeonggang province. And so there is a great deal of opportunity for cultural exchange. But we understand that the South Korean government has to approve that engagement. And how can NGOs and religions work together to be able to address the food crisis right now? And how do we have cultural exchange of reforestation? And what do you think about the permission that's needed to get that access to North Korea from both sides?
Well, I think, as we were saying earlier, though, there are efforts such as reforestation efforts. And one of the things that we can do, that our movement can do, is to help celebrate some of the efforts that are already being made. In other words, not only doing our own projects, but lifting up the projects that other conscientious people are also doing. We have to do this together. And if we do that, we can become a leader of those conscientious groups that are doing that. The Korean government is very sensitive to political pressure internally. They want to have success with North Korea, this present regime. And at the same time, they also, they're very sensitive to the civil society. We're looking toward the next regime and what it will be like, and that's a critical question. This is a very live question here on the peninsula. I would say that the work that UPF is doing around the world, all the webinars focused on Korea, are really to the point that the political, economic, philosophical resources, religious resources from around the world are paying attention to the Korean Peninsula, and that, I think, will move us forward. So I think that kind of a soft pressure needs to be brought to bear on the Korean government, because it's clear that some kinds of Christians have been opposing our movement, but those kinds of Christians are actually losing influence in today's Korea. And so the momentum is shifting now. So I think the situation actually is optimistic, but there's no time to lose.
Very good. Well, we thank you both as your fine scholarship and leadership. And Dr. Ward, I'd like you to conclude with just tell us about the Peace and Development Institute at UTS, or the development of that whole sphere of peace and diplomacy and development at UTS.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Actually, this is an area that we're just working on right now. We're in the midst of developing some academic material. We already have a number of courses that in this field. We have a course on conflict analysis and transformation. We have a course on diplomacy, which we are teaching. We have a course in place which also deals with the theology of peace building. And we are building, and we are now exploring the possibility of developing a degree program. We'll have more news on that, I hope, in the not so distant future, but it's something we're working on very actively, and we're very happy that we're having some very important conversations with UPF and with our UPF chair, Dr. Thomas Walsh, in this. We've been working on this with his input and support.
And we're looking forward to that. Dr. Selover, you're in Korea right now.
I sure am.
So how's the feeling in Korea from your perspective towards North Korea? Do they want the peninsula to come together in general?
It's varied. I think that there is a lot of interest among some people in the religious communities. I mean, the pressure that young people feel in South Korean society tends to make them think, well, I have to concern myself with getting ahead in my society. So there are counter pressures as well. That's why I'm saying there's a certain window of opportunity here. The theme of reunification of Korea still draws popular support. The President Moon's initiatives were quite popular. But the way that those negotiations kind of came to an impasse again puzzles a lot of people, I would say, in terms of what kind of strategy can actually bring us closer together. But the desire is still there, but it has to be acted on in a timely way, I would say.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're looking forward to pursuing this further. We want to thank our audience again for coming on Tuesdays at 2. We're learning so much about the possibilities for peace in Northeast Asia. We believe that America's role is central and that we have to be very strong, but also very wise in how we engage China, North Korea, and all of our allies, and stay strong with our allies. I'd like to invite back our Secretary General, Mr. Larry Moffett, the North American Secretary General, to give us our instructions for what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Wow, this was an amazing thing. Thank you, gentlemen, and Dr. Selover. It's 4 a.m. there, and you've already done a day's work. Next week we will not have our usual Tuesday webinar, but rather Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. From April 28, 29, and 30, we will have an International Leadership Conference 2021, which will deal with issues of the Korean Peninsula from the perspectives of several spheres, including the political, national leaders and parliamentarians, the role of religion and faith leaders, women's issues and leadership, business, communication media, academia, and even culture and arts. So it's going to be an exciting 3 days. So please tune in. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we'll have some promotional materials out on that, 28, 29, 30. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Duffy, also for putting this great program together. We'll see you 2 weeks from now on 2 p.m. on Tuesday.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.